reviewing the empire of normality here. So Chapman does make a point that most neurodiversity theory has remained within a liberal capitalist framework, and that capitalists have adapted to the neurodivergent inclusion to aid profit. And he also talks about the increased capture of neurodiversity advocacy by elites, for example, the conservative Matt Hancock, who launched a neurodiversity charity yet has pursued austerity. He talks about rise of neurofactorism. For example, neurodiversity advocacy has turned into a business-oriented program for unearthing so-called neurodiverse strengths. And then he talks about something called neuroqueering. Neuroqueering is a funny term. Which is this idea that you can embrace your weird potential, embracing weird potentials within one's neurocognitive space and turning everyday behaviour into forms of resistance, combating neuronormativity. I kind of take issue with this because I come at it from more a traditional left approach. Like, I don't particularly get on with the new left because I sort of feel that it's all very well to perform little acts of resistance in everyday life, but how is that actually going to change the system? It's not actually going to change the system. Like, no one gives a shit if someone performs these little so-called acts of resistance. That's a very new age, new left kind of very anodyne way of dealing with problems. Like, it's far... how is that actually going to help people like me who need a universal income, actually get access to services and stop being treated like shit? How is that actually going to help people like me? Just because these privileged people can do little acts of resistance now and again. If you ask me, that's really elitist, and that's the problem with the new left. It's obsessed with identity and these minor little acts of resistance that makes them feel, it's all like virtue signalling. Oh, look at me, I'm such an anti-capitalist, I'm doing these little acts of resistance. Well, meanwhile, we've got the most disgusting Tory government in power, and really, they should be out on the streets doing proper old school, old left style revolutionary activities, but no, they just talk about these little acts of resistance. It's so stupid, but anyway. Unfortunately, I can't be out on the street engaging in any of that because of the extent of my disability, but people who can should be. And I would if I could. But anyway. Really, the only way to overthrow the current repressive system is collective action. That's traditional old left ways of mobilisation that I feel the new left has kind of lost. And that's probably part of the reason why we've had the Tories in power since 1983. Okay. So the neuroqueering, not very impressed. He says that capital requires an ambiguity in beliefs about mental illness and disablement. It requires us to believe in disablement just enough to justify the maintenance of a surplus class, but it also requires us to be sceptical enough so that we can get away with not providing support. He says, where anti-psychiatry gets the analysis wrong, he says this is where anti-psychiatrists gets the analysis wrong, as it's helpful for capital. He says mainstream recent critical society has seen a shift from abolition to reformism in psychiatry. And they often emphasise a raising recognition of disability and diagnoses such as ADHD or reframing PTSD as mere distress. For example, someone called James Davies, who's prominent in the sort of neo-anti-psychiatry movement, which is now rehashed as critical psychiatry. He says his own work goes back towards a moral model of disability. That's James Davies, by the way. James Davies's work goes back towards a moral model of disability, where distress is understood as potential for learning and growth. He says this justifies the needs of the masses to suffer than to justify alleviating it. He says the Socialist Patients Collective in West Germany in the 1970s saw mental illness as a fact, but for them it was primarily caused by societal factors. And that's where I would disagree. Like I said, I can't deny that society definitely increases mental illness, not going to deny that. But it's not just caused by society. It's not just caused by society. And then he talks about Peter Sedgwick, who I mentioned before, socialist Peter Sedgwick. 1982 wrote a book called Psychopolitics, and he's a Marxist, and he has critiqued the dualism of the anti-psychiatrists. He recognises the reality of mental illness as illness, and that's necessary for making demands from the state. And he also talks about the radical mental health magazine Asylum. He says attempts to deny the reality of mental illness or disability are harmful. And he says they waste a huge effort swapping terms, for example, illness for distress, without improving the material conditions, and they justify the mass cultural denial of the recognition of disablement, or the state's denial of a requirement to provide support. The thing is though, the neurodiversity movement isn't all that different. They constantly try and change words without doing anything as well. Yes, we talked about the Socialist Patients Collective Manifesto, which is titled Turn Illness into a Weapon. And this called for the use of illness to demand support. That was back in the 1970s. The use of illness to demand support. That's interesting. He says he does not deny that there can be a pathological aspect to some forms of disability, which may require medical assistance, he says. But he resists the idea that disability is merely an individual problem. Well, I'd agree it's not merely an individual problem, but that's why we need a biopsychosocial approach, which provides a balanced synthesis, in my view. He talks about how conceptions of ability and normality change in different contexts. Yes, they might change to some extent, but not to the extent that it becomes a relative term. Do you know what I mean? Some people will always be disabled no matter what. He talks about pressure to erase recognition of disability. He's against that. He said we must be realists. Recognition of state's responsibility to provide support. But he talks about disablement as always relationally produced between the body, mind and the world. Not merely an individual problem. He talks about how perceptions of normality and impairment change in different contexts. Like I say, they might change in different contexts, but not enough to, not enough to make someone not impaired who's going to be impaired no matter what for context. I mean, it depends how impaired you are, I guess. Like someone like me is going to be impaired no matter what for context. So, he talks about how more people become disabled or non-disabled in relation to each other and their environments. Again, that's very heavily based on the social model. He says compared to the norm, more people become disabled or non-disabled in relation to each other and their environments compared to the norm. Again, this is very relativistic, this language. Like I say, it might apply to those who are minimally afflicted. So people like me are always going to be impaired no matter what. He says, our current disabilities emerge because of objective material relations emerging from the empire of normality. And that's an absolute load of crap. Our current disabilities emerged, excuse me, but people like me have always been disabled, like going right back to the beginnings of time. People like me have always been disabled. They have not suddenly, our current disabilities have not just emerged from the rise of objective material conditions. That's such a reductionist, silly argument, and it's really ahistorical. That is just so not correct. Anyway, he says, he does not mean normality and divergence are not real. He says he only means that their reality is socially and materially constituted and is altered only through material change. Does not mean normality and divergence are not real. So again, this whole idea that they're basically constructed, although he has said that some form of disablement will always exist no matter what, so he allows for that, but again, he seems to contradict himself, which is kind of, so I'm not quite sure how he can do that. He contradicts himself, like he says, he basically says here in so many words that they're basically constructed by material conditions, and I don't agree with that at all. I think what I'm meaning is that just because they didn't have a term for normal before the word normal was invented, because the word normal hasn't always been in our vocabulary. It's from the Latin normalis, referring to carpenter's square. Just because it hasn't always been available as a word doesn't mean that previous societies didn't have an idea of rightness or wrongness or of something being abnormal. They might not have had the words for it, they might not have used those words, but hell, they would have known if something was stepping out of line. I mean, you only have to look at the witch trials to see that. I mean, this is so naive, this argument. I mean, come on, man. But yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that he argues that normality and he argues that the reality of divergence is socially and materially constituted, but that kind of ignores kind of basic kind of animal facts, like the fact that certain things are just not optimal for survival as a human animal, and like no matter what society, it's not desirable to have a brain that can't function. That is abnormal. I'm just stating the facts. It's not a construct. It's abnormal, and there's nothing wrong with that as such. It's just a fact, you know. Just as like having something malfunctioning in your heart isn't exactly optimal for survival. It's a similar sort of thing. So that's not socially or materially constituted. I mean, you've got something problem with your heart. That's got nothing to do with society. That's just a fact. No, I say it's the same thing. Yeah, he says disability is a fact. So he says disability is a fact, but even if it always arises in a social and ideological context, he says the boundaries are shifting. Well, I'll always be disabled no matter what society, so that doesn't apply to me. Okay, I'm going to stop now. I've actually realised I've got more to go through than I thought. I keep on thinking I'm coming to the end. But there's so much here, so I'm going to have to stop. And I will get to your comments at some point. I know I haven't managed to get to them yet, but I will, so don't worry, I will. Just take me a bit of time. Thank you for watching.